for the last 4 weeks, Christians, our Christian brethren, have been observing the season of Advent. And they observe the season of Advent because they're waiting for the coming birth of Jesus Christ. Now, I was raised Catholic, as many of you know, and like other Christian kids, I enjoyed Christmas thoroughly. Of course, I liked the gifts, but Advent and Christmas offered something more than just these material pleasures. The season had a palatable magic for me. It had a mystery to it. In fact, one of my favorite stories was and remains A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. And I remember my mother would always have an Advent calendar for me. She bought it from the local German-owned store, the little German man. So it was a traditional German Advent calendar with little German chocolates in it. Mm. And I would love to open a door every day during Advent to find out what was behind one of those doors. Would it be a chocolate mouse, or a chocolate Santa, or something else? So yeah, that was great. And it also got me excited about Santa Claus, right? And my mother would tell me stories about her childhood and her Christmases. See, her father was a baker, so he kept very odd hours. And he really wasn't a religious man. He was sort of the elf for the family. So my mother and her brother and her mother would go to midnight mass, and they'd leave the house, and it was really dark and dull, and there was no decorations. But when they came back, there the house was all lit up. There was a tree, it was decorated, and there'd be this beautiful gingerbread house that my grandfather made for my mother. And she just loved it so much. It was so exciting for her. So my mother tried to create that for me and my siblings as a child. But she never was quite able to create that sort of magical Christmas feel. In part because her father, the baker, the elf that made Christmas what it was for her, died on December 13th, 1960. He died just after the birth of my second eldest sister, and he lived in New Jersey. So for that Christmas, my mother, instead of welcoming her father to St. Louis, had to go to his funeral. So ever since that day, I think my mother never quite enjoyed Christmas the way she used to as a child. And as I aged, I began to just want Christmas to be over with, because my mother was not a very happy person at Christmas time. She was irritable, she was depressed. And of course, after my brother explained to me when I was about 7, it's always the older brother, right? I'm the baby of the family. But there was no Santa Claus. It was even more depressing. Yeah. So, I was Catholic, right? And I really was a devout Catholic. I loved Jesus. And I wanted to learn everything I could about Jesus when I was in the Catholic grade school. I was kind of a Jesus nerd, you might say. I would actually read the Bible at recess, and sometimes I'd go over to the church that was part of the school complex. So kids didn't really like me that much because I was just this holy roller. But, reading the Bible as I did, I read Leviticus in 5th grade. And I got really into Leviticus. I mean, the kosher law. I was like, man, so why do we eat pork? Why do we eat pork on Jesus' birthday? Jesus was a Jew. Why do we celebrate Christmas and Easter that way with something that is treif, that is forbidden by kosher law? And I began to have all these questions. Why the heck do we do the things we do as Christians when Jesus was a good Jew? Why don't we follow the kosher law? So, I was very, very confused by all this and curious. And I began asking questions about Santa Claus. So where did that come from? Because I don't see Santa Claus in the Bible either. And I was told when I read my sister's Book of Saints that Santa Claus was based on St. Nicholas, whose feast day was December 6th. Okay? So some churches will celebrate St. Nick's Day, as a matter of fact. And I was told that he was a saint that was from Turkey in the 4th century, and that he had helped the poor by giving gifts and gathering the resources of the community. But it still didn't explain Santa Claus in many respects. Because I said, why does Santa Claus come on the 25th if he's based on St. Nick, who was December 6th? And moreover, does it snow in Turkey in December? I mean, it might. They have mountains there. And, is there enough snow to drive a sleigh? And did they have sleighs in Turkey? And, where does this idea of Santa flying through the air come from? That's just crazy, man. I don't see it in the Bible anywhere. So here I was, having all these questions, a 10-year-old, 11-year-old. By the time I get to high school, a bunch of these questions start getting answered because I decided I would take Latin. I wanted to read the Bible in Latin someday. That was my big goal. And of course, when you're studying Latin, you also have to study the culture. So I learned a lot about ancient Rome and the culture of ancient Rome. And I learned about a little festival called Saturnalia. Saturnalia was the winter solstice celebration of the ancient Romans. And it began December the 17th, and it continued until December 25th. I also learned that Romans liked pork. They liked it a lot. They considered it a delicacy, and they would consume it at feasts. And I also learned that Romans were really good in invading other countries and other places. And, they wouldn't necessarily overturn those cultures. They just absorbed the culture into their own. They would appropriate the culture. And they would appropriate the gods of these local places. Well, the Romans conquered Palestine and Jerusalem. So guess what they did? They appropriated the Hebrew Bible, and they also appropriated Yahweh and Jesus, the Son of God. Now, by my 20s, I got really interested in Joseph Campbell. I don't know, how many have you read Joseph Campbell, right? Okay. Power of Myth, the hero with 1,000 faces. I also discovered a man named Sir James Frazer, who wrote the book called The Golden Bough. And so I read about all these crazy myths from pre-Christian Europe. I learned about the Norse god Odin, who flew through the sky on what? A reindeer. I learned about the Persian sun god, Mithra, who was also probably derived from Ra, the Egyptian god of the sun. So, Mithra, let me tell you about Mithra. Persian, but also Greek, and he allegedly sprung up full grown from a cave. He was armed with a knife and carrying a torch. And shepherds were watching when he came out of this cave, and they hurried to greet him with their flocks. In other legends about Mithra in Asia Minor and the Near East, Mithra was allegedly born of the Virgin Mother, Anahita, who placed him in a manger where he was tended by shepherds. I also learned that the cult of Mithra was very active and widespread in the Roman territories in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, when Christianity was in its infancy. Many Roman soldiers worshipped Mithras Sol Invictus, which means in Latin, the unconquerable sun. They worshipped Sol Invictus as the dying and resurrected God. And they believed that by observing certain rites, namely eating the flesh and blood of a sacrificed god, a young bull, they would have eternal life and conquer death. And that makes a lot of sense if you're a Roman soldier. Now, St. Paul, who was the apostle to the Gentiles, may have incorporated these Mithraic ideas into his preaching. He grew up in Tarsus, in the province of Cilicia, which is now a part of modern-day Turkey, and Mithras worship was very strong in Tarsus. In fact, it was a center of Mithra worship, and it had a very large temple to the god Mithra. So in studying all of these myths and learning about all of these ideas that have been floating around for the last 2,000 years, it became very clear to me that the celebrations around December 25th really began as pagan celebrations of the winter solstice. But how, I asked myself, did it land on the 25th? Why isn't it the 21st or the 22nd? Well, this is what happened. See, it's all a matter of calendars, what kind of calendars they used. So in 274 CE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian declared the birthday of Sol Invictus to be December 25th. In the calendar of that day, December 25th was the solstice. Okay, that was the Julian calendar. But then it was shifted many centuries later to a new calendar, and then it shifted back. The solstice actually shifted to the 21st, but December 25th remained the birthday of Sol Invictus, and then later was named to be the birthday of Jesus. That was when, in what, 1343, apparently, we had Pope Julius I designated December 25th as the birth of Jesus. So that's basically how it all happened. It was essentially a celebration of Sol Invictus, or Mithra. And then when it became Christianized, when Christianity was no longer practicing in the dark, it was decriminalized by Constantine, it became the birth of Jesus, because most people were becoming Christian. It was all the rage to become a Christian back in the 4th century. So I learned that's how it all happened. Indeed, Syrian bishop Dionysius Salabi wrote in the 12th century, "It was customary for pagans to celebrate the birth of the sun. When the doctors of the church perceived that Christians had a leaning towards this festival, they took counsel and resolved that the true nativity should be solemnized on that day," meaning December the 25th. So, I now understood a basic fact, a truth about Christmas. It didn't really explain much about Santa Claus, but it did say to me, okay, so they're appropriating Odin as Santa Claus, and that's a way to get the children to behave, right? Okay, I can accept that. But I was also finding that I was losing my religion. And I was finding that I was not finding any meaning in Christmas. Not at all. What spiritual meaning could this season have for me? Frankly, it had become for me by that time in my 20s a time of consumption, gross consumption. It was all about this orgy of stuff. That wasn't meaningful for me. It sickened me as an environmentalist. And moreover, I was a young geologist. I didn't need all these myths to explain the workings of our planet. I knew that the sun was a flaming ball of gas. It's not a god. And I knew that it wanes and becomes more, the days become longer because what? The tilt of the earth and the rotation around the sun. I had science to explain all this. And I knew that life itself was a miracle because of my scientific training. In fact, science taught me that life is a miracle. When you think about the odds of us being here today on this planet, that's crazy. But then here is where science falls down. It can't tell me what the meaning of all this is. And that's why I came back to religion, so to speak. I found myself back in a UU church in my 20s. And I found in that UU congregation a group of people who were studying earth-centered traditions, specifically the religious or spiritual traditions of the Lenni Lenape, who are the indigenous people of the Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania region. And in this group, I learned a great deal about earth-centered traditions, including Wicca, which is the modern form of a pre-Christian European earth-centered tradition. And I learned in that group that this winter solstice in the Northern Hemisphere, at least, has been honored and celebrated over the millennia by nearly every culture on this planet. In fact, most of these indigenous peoples structure their entire year around the rhythms of the seasons. For them, winter in the Northern Hemisphere was a time of rest. It was a preparation for rebirth of the earth itself in the spring. And because the earth rested, because the earth was the sacred deity to them, they likewise rested. Winter solstice for many of these ancient cultures was a holy day that represented hope for the future. So, I found a great deal of meaning in this theology. And I find it to be relevant even today in this very technological age, when we're often cut off from the natural world. Not only does it connect me with nature, it encourages me to rest. It encourages me to take a break and look at my own renewal, my own rebirth. And I think it does that for a lot of us, whether we realize it or not, and whether we worship Jesus as God or not, whether we worship any God for that matter. It seems like a natural time. It's darker for longer at night. You want to rest anyway. And I find that this theology is extremely critical today as well, because of the pressing matter of climate change and widespread environmental degradation. It teaches us that we humans are part of creation, not above it. We're part of it. And no matter how clever we are, we did not create this universe, and certainly not this earth. So I find a very profound truth in this pagan idea of the earth as a sacred thing. And I do mourn the fact that religions in general don't seem to recognize this more than they should. I often wonder what would happen if we could make a religion that focused upon the earth as being sacred space. But my real point in this is to ask, are you as UUs? What am I as a UU waiting for in this season? Maybe you don't believe in God. Maybe you don't view Jesus as God. Maybe you're a scientist and hey, the sun eventually is going to come back, so to speak. The days are going to get longer. They're starting to get longer already, even though it's by just a nanosecond. So what is the meaning of this season of waiting, this Advent, for us? I think for me, it's about anticipating my renewed self. In other words, I am the one I am waiting for. I think it is a call to my own agency and the agency of humanity to create that heaven on earth. We are the ones we are waiting for. And so I suggest to you that might be what's meaningful for you. Maybe you already do this at the new year. Maybe as this fellowship grows and continues on, it is a natural time to ask, what does this fellowship want to do in the coming year, in the next 5 years? It is a time to ask ourselves, how do we wish to be reborn in this new solar year? And I welcome to hear your thoughts.